Sorry. Recording has started. So I thought I'd get back to the basics and talk about the RPA. We will get into, the Corona addendum that would go with the RPA, but let's just start with the RPA. And I'm going to go and I'm going to share my screen. And what you should be seeing is Safari. Thumbs up, Kim. You're seeing that?
Looks
okay,
good.
Great. So in order to get to your zip forms, obviously you sign into car.org and then you click on your zip forms and let's just get going from here. And if you haven't already, your local association, because I don't know who exactly is on all this, your local association will give you classes on creating templates, digital signing or electronic signing, be it DocuSign or digital ink. So you should really take advantage of those classes they're free. So I mentioned that because you all should have created a template, and these are my templates. I have one for listings and I have one for purchase agreements, and if you do mobile homes, you might have one for that. But I want to show you what's in my residential purchase template, and right now it's only 2 forms. All you really need is the cover sheet and you need the RPA. For some of you, you might also attach the Keller Williams affiliated business addendum or whatever. But when you create your template, now I'm still in a template, you're going to fill in stuff that always is the same in every purchase agreement that you write. Namely, if you're always going to ask, remember you're on the buyer side, you're going to ask for your escrow company or seller's choice. Just on the chance they will use our escrow company, why not? And then you're going to fill in your information, the buyer's broker's information. You're going to fill that all in, and title, whatever your title company is, my NHD for disclosure, and home warranty. Those are things that are consistent with pretty much every single offer that you write. So you're going to put all that in there, and you're going to save it as your template. So I'm just going to go back to the dashboard because we're going to start a brand new transaction. We're going to start a transaction. We're going to add a new one. It's a new purchase agreement. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4. You usually name your transaction by the address, so it's easy to find. It's residential, and then you're going to see here, select template and look for your templates, and it's the personal residential purchase, and then say save. So now it's going to open a window with your documents, and those documents are already there. You open the cover sheet, and the cover sheet already has that information that is in every offer that you write. So you don't have to go back and put that in. So all you're going to have to do is put in, your buyer's name, your seller's name, and then you're going to go down here, and up on this this up here, there's eSign and there's MLS Connect and there's Record Connect. MLS Connect, you're writing an offer on a property that's in the MLS. So click on MLS Connect. For those of you who use ChrisNet, this always defaults to Claw, and you're going to have to change it to CRMLS. And I've chosen a listing. That's not it. 2126069. So I'm going to put in that listing ID number and say find. And it should, there it is. It's 22953 Oxnard Street. If you want to include the photo, sure, why not include the photo? And you're going to import that. And this window always comes up and it says it's going to wipe out everything that you've put in there. I've never had it do that, so but don't quote me on that because it's me. You're going to say yes, and it's been successfully imported. And what you see here is it's imported the stats on the property. So they've already been imported along with the seller broker information. So that information is automatically in there. So you're basically done with your template or your cover sheet, excuse me. So you can go back and it's going to save it. So now you're going to open your residential purchase agreement. And if you see, it has Mr. Buyer there. So the first thing that you're going to see is the agency disclosure. This is a statute that the state has put together that it's a statute that has two parts. The first part is that you have to inform the client or the consumer of the different types of agency. So that's exactly what this form does. It tells them about the different types of agency. A seller's agent, what the responsibility is of a seller's agent, a buyer's agent, and an agent representing both seller and buyer. And always remember, when we're talking agent in this particular sense, we're talking about the brokerage. We're not talking about you as the agent. We're talking about the brokerage. So if you represent the buyer and the seller's agent is another agent at your office, another agent at Keller Williams Calabasas, and this listing that I pulled up, it just so happens to be David Smith at Calabasas. So that would be a dual agent situation, because David is at Keller Williams Calabasas and I am at Keller Williams Calabasas, and they share two things. They share a corporation and it's the same DRE number. So so that's what this form does. It satisfies the first part of the statute in informing what types of agency there is. Now, the second page of this form is the actual code. It's the actual statute. And if you want, if you're having trouble sleeping one night, you can go ahead and read that. But there is one thing in here. It says confirmation, and it's just a sample to satisfy the second part of the statute. And the second part of the statute is, okay, you've been informed of what different type of agencies there are. Now, who is representing who? So who is the seller's brokerage firm and who is the buyer's brokerage firm? And it's just telling you in this statute to look out for this, in order to give those agency confirmations. So that's the first part of when you're writing a purchase agreement. And oh my goodness, there we go. My mouse stuck for a minute there. So the second form that is bundled in with your RPA is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. And once again, we're talking about brokerage. We're not talking about agents. So Keller Williams Calabasas represents multiple buyers, may be interested in this property. They may also be representing sellers of this property or other properties similar to it. That's all this form is doing. It's disclosing this information. So I am having problems with this mouse. There we go. The third form is really important. Wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. Most funds are transferred electronically. Well, that brings some problems in that there is a lot of wire fraud out there. And it's very important for you to mention to your client that you, the agent, will never, ever, and you should never do this, give wiring instructions. They come from escrow office. They will send them the wiring instructions, and when they receive those wiring instructions, they should call the escrow office and verify that information over the phone with the escrow officer. So that's very important because there are people who shadow your emails, see how you text, see how you respond, the type of language that you use in your emails, and they're very good at, how many have gotten that email? I have gotten an email from somebody that I know personally saying, "Help me, I'm stuck. I need to get some money. I lost my wallet. I did this." I've gotten those emails, but be smart about it because click on the email and it'll show, if it shows a different email than that of from that person, that's a scam. And always call these people. That's that. Oh no, there we go. So now here we are. We're at the first page of the purchase agreement. So always put a date in there of when it's prepared, because that date is used on subsequent forms throughout the transaction. So you put a date in there when it's prepared. It's automatically filled out, the APN number, the address, and that's all coming from your cover sheet. So that's great. So we're going to offer $500,000, okay, for this 1 point something property. Close of escrow, very important. It could be a specific date, and that way you would check that, or it's a number of days, and usually it's going to be a number of days. And it's really important to have a good relationship if there's a loan on this property with the lender, because and a way to make your offer look a little better is to shorten some time periods. So if you can close in 21 days, then put 20, talk to the lender and say, yeah, I can do it. Then, make it 21 days, but we're going to make it 30, which is usually the standard. Then here is that confirmation. Here is that where you're going to confirm who the agency relationships are. So since they're both Keller Williams Calabasas, it's both the buyer and seller. Look at that. It checked all these boxes automatically, because there's no way, once you say one is both, then all of them are the same. So, and very important to make sure that this information is filled out. So many times I see RPAs that have not filled this out correctly. And once again, I'm going to repeat, this is a statute. So this needs to be filled out correctly. So, and if it's not, there's another form called the agency confirmation, because that's what we're doing. We're confirming, and that needs to be filed. That needs to be needs to be done. So so there you have it. So I should have done that. I think okay. So initial deposit. We like to have 3% deposit, which would be 15,000. And the reason why we like to have 3%, it'll be explained a little later, and you'll understand. Leave this blank at all if you entirely can do that. It's that the money is going to be direct deposited directly by electronic funds to escrow. You don't want to touch a check. The minute you touch a check, that check has to be logged with the office and it has to be accounted for. So don't, under any circumstances, touch a check if you can avoid it. So the initial deposit is 3%, and then there's going to be a loan on this. So he's going to put 20% down. So 20% down is $100,000, and so that will leave a loan of 400,000. I hope I'm counting. Yes, I'm working this right. So that's a $400,000 loan. Check these boxes or fill out these boxes. You don't want to leave them blank. And if it's an FHA loan, if it's a VA loan, check those boxes. But you do want to put a limit as to how much the rate can be. And so we're going to say it's not to exceed, the loan is at a fixed rate, not to exceed 5%. Rates are really good. I'm going to put 4.5. You always put a little pad there, and and buyers shall pay points not to exceed a half a point. A point usually is 1 point is 1% of the loan, and buyers pay points in order to get a better rate, to buy something down. So that's what a point is. Additional financing terms. Something that's going to affect the financing. Something like seller to pay $3,000 towards buyer's closing costs. That's an example of what would go in there. I want to go back once. It says increase deposit. If the buyer has $3,000 now or $5,000 now, and then after they do the inspection in 10 days, they'll put another $10,000 in to increase their deposit to the 3%. That's possible. You can write that in, and that's how that would look. So we're done with the first page. On to the second. Verification of down payment. Check this box because nobody's going to look at your offer unless you show them that they have the 20% down, which would be $100,000. So you've got to show that amount plus a little for closing costs. So attach your verification. And they're also not going to look at your offer if there's no loan approval. Not a loan pre-qualification, a loan approval. And what's the difference between that? A loan pre-qualification is based on what this guy told me, he can qualify for this loan. A loan pre-approval is that I have looked at his financials, I've looked at his tax returns, I've looked at his bank records, and based on everything I've looked at, I have approved this loan. That's a big difference. So, you want a pre-approval. What happens if you're working with a buyer that hasn't been pre-approved yet? Do you just not work with them? Well, in the beginning, I would work with them, but get them in touch with a lender, right away, saying, "Come on, if we find something, we have to act fast. So you're going to need to be pre-approved. So let's get you in touch with my lender and get that process going. It only takes a few days. It doesn't take long to get pre-approved. And then if they really don't want to, or they're dragging their heels about doing it, I think seriously about working with that person, because that person may not really be a serious buyer, especially in this market with COVID and all that going on. So it's really important to be pre-approved. So loan contingency removal. Once again, talk to the lender. Maybe you can shorten that. Maybe we can shorten that to 17 days. Okay. Here's if you're not going to have any loan contingency on this property, then you would check this here saying no loan contingency. Lender limits on buyer credits. There's times when a seller is going to give some credit to the buyer. Sorry, my throat is really dry. And another reason to be in touch with that lender, you need to know what the limits are for the lender. Because usually it's around 3%. So say you didn't check with your lender, and the seller is going to give your buyer $20,000 credit because they found all this stuff wrong with the property or for whatever reason. And so you go, all those credits need to be disclosed to the lender. So you go to the lender and say, "Oh yeah, Mr. Lender, the buyer's getting $20,000 credit." Lender goes, "Whoa, I only allow 15." So the seller is only responsible for giving $15,000 credit. Now that buyer is not going to be very happy, and they're going to look to you for the extra $5,000. So we don't want to get into that situation. Oh no. No. Oh, there we go. So that was limits. Buyer stated financing. Basically, what this is saying is that Mr. Buyer is representing that this is how I'm going to get a loan for $400,000 at 5%, or up to 4.5%, or whatever we put there, and that's how I'm going to finance it. Now, if he should choose to suddenly say, "You know what, I don't want to put 20% down," can he do that? Absolutely, he can do that. He can change that as long as he's not asking the seller to make some concessions and extend any of the time frames. Another place that this comes in is that they say, "Okay, it's an all cash offer. It's all cash offer with 20-day escrow." So then the buyer decides he wants a loan. Well, he can do that as long as he can get that loan within the 20-day time frame. The minute that he's asking for extra time, the seller doesn't have to give it. So just be aware of that. So right here, we're talking about um, talking about sale of buyer's property. This agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing is not contingent on the sale of the property by buyer, or if you check this box, it is. He needs to sell his property before he can buy this one. So if that's the case, you would check this box and another form would pop up in your transaction called the COP, contingency on purchase of buyer's property. So, so if we have some time, then I will talk about that one. So here we have addendas and advisories that are attached to this. I always attach the KW affiliated business addendum, the ABA, that tells what businesses are affiliated with our office. Why do I do that? Because you need to disclose that to the seller prior to him accepting an offer. So I always attach that one. Other terms. What are other terms? If you're buying personal property, you may want to put that in here. If you, as a real estate agent, you need to disclose that if you are buying this, you have to say that buyer is a licensed real estate agent, or if you're representing your sister or your mother or any of that, that would need to be disclosed, that you're related. Also, that if a buyer not related to you is buying this, you need to disclose that. So why do you need to disclose that? Here's why. Because somebody who has a real estate license has more knowledge about such a transaction than the normal person. So you need to disclose that to all parties. So that's that. So allocation of costs. It's customary for the seller to pay for a natural hazard disclosure report, and I always include the environmental. It's like $20 more. I'm asking that my NHD provide that, and our office is affiliated with my NHD. So that's one reason that we would have to include that. These are to include other reports that you want the seller or the buyer are going to provide. I see a lot as the broker that this will be checked, that seller to pay for the following report: a termite report or a wood destroying pet report. And I'm telling you right now, don't do it. Termite does not belong in this agreement. Why? Because once you put termite as a part of the residential purchase agreement, the lender is going to see that. So in order for that property to be transferred, they're going to want to see a termite clearance. Well, your buyer, there may be some, there may be like $5,000 worth of repairs that have to be done related to termite or wood destroying pests. So, but your buyer doesn't really, they're going to remodel. So they don't really want that. They'd rather have the cash. Well, you've taken that ability away from the buyer because the lender will force that work to be done prior to the close of escrow. So that's why it doesn't belong in this form. So then we go. Oh, did I miss it? I did. Governmental requirements and retrofit. The seller shall pay for all the smoke alarms, all those, the water heater bracing, all of that prior to close of it. That is required by the government. Seller shall pay for the cost of the compliance with the minimum mandatory governmental inspections. Some areas require inspections prior to the close of escrow. Pasadena used to do it. They've laxed that, but I believe Thousand Oaks still does it. There are there are areas where there are certain inspections that need to take place before close of escrow during for that property to be transferred, and we ask that the seller do that. Now, can the buyer pay that? Sure, doesn't matter. You're just allocating who is going to pay for that. Do you leave it blank? No. Always check something here. And then the seller to pay for the cost of the governmental retrofit standards. In Los Angeles, it's required that a retrofit inspection take place, and that be included in that is the DWP certification and all of that. So we ask that the that the seller pay for that. Escrow and title, you're going to check them both. Why? Because there are fees that belong to the buyer and there are fees that belong to the seller. So each are going to pay their own fees. Do not put 50-50. They're never 50-50. There's always somebody paying more. So you want the buyer to pay for their fees and the seller to pay for theirs. So, and then the seller to pay for the title. We're going to have the seller pay for the county and city taxes. If it's an HOA, they would pay for these fees. And I always check under private transfer fees that the seller will pay if applicable. I think that's, yes. And then we ask for the seller to pay for a home warranty, and always check with your rep as to what the cost is. Always upgrade if it has an air conditioner. If you're upgrading, let's see if this is in here. If it's going to include the fridge, the washer and dryer, put in everything that you want. Don't just put in an amount and then think that you can use that amount up until it's gone. That's not how it works. You have to put in specifically what this warranty is going to cover. If the buyer is waiving a home warranty, then you would check right there. Then we get into what's included and excluded. If there's stoves there, check it. If there's refrigerators, check it if your buyer wants it, and washer and dryers. Now, what happens? A lot of people say, well, in the MLS it said the washers and dryers were included, so I don't have to check all this. No, you do. Just because it said it in the MLS doesn't make it binding to this agreement. The seller may have had a change of heart. The seller may be ticked off that you're offering $500,000 on a $1.5 million house. So he'll say, okay, I'll sell it to you for that much, but you're not giving me my washer and dryer. So always, whatever you want, you have to include in the contract. Leased items, this is very important, like on solar systems or water softeners. Make sure you're aware of these items, and because a lot of times the new buyer has to assume the cost of these because it's a monthly rental or something like that, or find out if they're owned free and clear. This you need to know all this. So this is why we don't accept blind offers. People, the agent has to have seen the property. Items, and I'm stuck again. Hold on. Oh, there we go. We jumped. Items excluded from the sale. If the buyer doesn't want the refrigerator or the stove, you can exclude it and make it their problem to get rid of it. And regarding brackets of, TVs are mounted a lot these days. Brackets are attached to the wall, so they stay with the property. Or if your buyer doesn't want them, he can check that it'll be removed and the holes will be patched, but they're not going to paint them. So just so you know. Very important, does the buyer intend to live in the property? If it's a seller occupied property, then possession is usually going to be at 6 o'clock on the date of close of escrow. Now you can change that. As a matter of fact, they are going to change this in the new RPA, which now is not coming out for another year, but it has been changed to at time of recording. But you can add that to here. You can say at time of recording. Most listing agents, though, will give you the property at the time of recording. If the seller is remaining in the possession of the property at close of escrow, even if it's for 1 day, you need to check this box, seller in possession, SIP. Now that's good for 1 day to 29 days. The minute that the seller is staying over 29 days, it's a different form, and it's the RLAS, residential lease after sale. Because now what you've done, because they're there for 30 days, you've made them a tenant. And it's very important that these forms be filled out, because it takes care of insurance, it takes care of who's paying for utilities, who's taking care of the landscape. That's all agreed upon in that form. So it's really important that those be included at the time that the agreement is made. So many agents saying, well, we're 3 weeks into this escrow and now I need to do a seller in possession. For one thing, if the seller comes to a buyer after the fact and they want to stay longer, the buyer doesn't have to agree to it. That's the truth. So that's really important. Now, tenant occupied property, the default in the agreement is that it's going to be delivered vacant 5 days prior to the close of escrow. Now, if the tenant is remaining, then it's a different form, the TIP, tenant to remain in possession, because that tenancy transfers over to the new buyer. So that's really, really important, because then the onus is on the new buyer to get that tenant out. I want to point out here, F would be 9F. At close of escrow, unless otherwise agreed in writing, seller shall provide keys, passwords, codes, and other means to operate all locks, mailboxes, security, blah, 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 blah. What does this mean? Well, the seller's staying over until, he's staying in possession a week after the close of escrow. So we'll give you the keys then. No. Per this agreement, the buyer is entitled to the keys, even a remote to the garage, at the close of escrow. That's in this contract, unless in writing you make other arrangements. So that's really, really important. Okay, section number 10. And once again, I don't know why this thing is, there we go. Section number 10, statutory and other disclosures. There are certain statutory disclosures that have to be made. Number one, when I say statutory, that means it's the law. So many people say, well, the seller, he doesn't want to fill out a TDS. He's just not going to do it. It's the law. He has to, unless he's exempt. So that's the TDS is statutory. If this is if it's older than 78, then the lead-based paint is statutory to be disclosed. So these are all statutory requirements that that the seller has to disclose to the buyer. And then if you see section, looking for it's in the section somewhere, is it mentions the SPQ. Now, the SPQ is not statutory, but unless it is countered out, here it is in 10A4, within a specific time period, seller, unless exempt from the obligation to provide a TDS, shall complete and provide the buyer with an SPQ. And what is an SPQ? You all should know that an SPQ is basically a TDS on steroids. It gets more into depth, like, what's the property line and what is the neighborhood like. It's a little more in depth. Natural hazard disclosures. This is the NHD report that we're having my NHD do. Withholding tax. If this isn't, there are certain circumstances where the buyer has to withhold income tax and send it to the IRS for the seller. That's usually when the property is not a primary residence and it's an investment property, and a certain percentage is sent to the tax board, but that's done through escrow. Megan's Law, there's a website for them to look up and see about sex offenders around the address, where the gas lines are. Now we get into if it's a condominium or a planned development. The seller has 7 days to reveal that. Sometimes it's not always known. There may be, single family houses that are under a planned urban development. And so it requires to disclose that there are CC&Rs and whatnot in place. Section 11, very important, condition of property. This is where in the contract it says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, the property is sold as is. So every property in California is sold as is. So when listing agents counter to the buyer, property sold as is, seller will not make any repairs or warranties, or that whole big paragraph that they write, I have to laugh because every property is sold as is. Now, a lot of agents ask me, well, because they say the seller will not make any repair, does that mean that my buyer can't do his inspections and ask for repairs? No, it doesn't. You can't take away a buyer's right to do inspections, and based on those inspections, what they find, they can always ask. The seller can still say no, and they can say, this is it. It's sold as is. I'm not doing anything. Either go through with the sale or cancel. That's fine. You always should remind the listing agent that anything that was presented in that listing agreement is now a material fact, and they have to disclose to every other buyer coming forward. So that's important. So I am stuck. Oh, here we go. All right. Buyer's investigation of property. This gives the buyer the right to do his investigations of the property. Even though he's allowed to do these investigations, it doesn't mean that he can damage the property. So he does have liability should he damage the property. And if you look at 12C, The seller shall have gas, water, electricity in operation. Basically, all the utilities need to be on in order to do these investigations. If they're not, then the buyer has every right to wait until that happens. Title investing. I'm not going to spend much time on this because we shouldn't be counseling our clients on how to take title. They should talk to we're not tax people. We sell real estate. So they should talk to their accountants. Time periods. Seller has 7 days to deliver all reports, disclosures, information to which seller is responsible for, so they have 7 days to hand over the TDS and the SBQ and all these other disclosures. Listing agents, you also should be handing over an avid with the TDS because it's not complete unless that is attached. Buyer has, in order to make it look a little better, you should shorten that. Buyer has 10 days to do all their inspections, and please, I always say this, that it doesn't only include the physical inspection. It also is, the neighborhood, talking to the local police department, going to the property at different times of day. A property could be different from one day to the next, one time period to the next. So it's more than just the physical inspection. Continuation of contingency. Basically what this is saying is that just because the 10 days are up, it doesn't go away. Everything has to be removed in writing. So, the seller, if you haven't removed it, can give you a notice to perform, and then you would either have to remove it or cancel. So removal contingencies, if the buyer is removing all contingencies at the time the offer is made, that's where you would check this box. But please, we do not advise a buyer to do that. Seller's right to cancel. If you're representing a seller, it's very, very important that you need to inform your seller that once they sign and agree to this offer, there may be counters and all that stuff, but they're basically stuck with this buyer. And the only way they can cancel this contract is if this buyer doesn't perform. That is the only way. Now, the buyer has a lot of different reasons to cancel. If they don't like something on the title, if they don't like something that they found during inspection, if they can't get the loan, if it doesn't appraise, those are all legitimate reasons for the buyer to get out. But the seller only has the right to cancel if the buyer doesn't perform. And if they don't perform, then the buyer needs to give the notice to buyer to perform. So that's really important, and that can be given 2 days prior to when the contingency is up. So, and that's days, full days, not until 5 o'clock. No, it's until 11:59 p.m. So if a contingency is up on a Friday, then the notice to perform could be given on the Wednesday. Okay, so it's 2 days prior, Wednesday, Thursday, and then they would have to remove it on that Friday. So, but everybody thinks that contingencies can't end on a weekend or a holiday. They can end on a weekend or a holiday. It's the way to enforce that contingency, the notice to perform, that can't end on a weekend or a holiday. So it would have to carry over to the next day. So just keep that in mind. And then if if somebody is not closing, they're not, oh, there we go. If they're not, if you're supposed to close escrow and they're just not closing escrow, the device for that is for 3 days prior to the close of escrow, or once you give a demand to close, they have 3 days to close, or the contract can be canceled. Effective cancellation on deposits. Um, if the buyer still has contingencies in place, 9 times out of 10, the effect of the cancellation is that they are given their deposit back, unless they're not acting in good faith. Um, so, um, uh, but if a buyer has removed all of their contingencies, that buyer will subsequently, his deposit is in jeopardy. And it's just not just handed over to the seller. That the money is held in escrow, and it's determined by a mediation or judicial decision or arbitration award as to what the outcome of that deposit is. Um, I want to point out a party may be subject to civil penalty up to $1,000 for refusing to sign cancellation instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to who is entitled to the deposited funds. Basically, what that says is, well, I'm not going to sign these cancellation things, you know, just because I don't want to, or whatever. That person is could be subject to a judicial fine of up to $1,000. Final verification of the condition of the property. Within 5 days of closing, that buyer should go through that property and do a final walkthrough. And this is not a contingency. It's just to make sure that the property is in the same condition that it was when the offer was made. And if there were repairs, that those repairs were done. That's all that is for. And and that's 15 and 16. Prorations of taxes. Please make sure that you tell your new buyers that taxes are prorated. Taxes are paid during escrow based on the taxes that were paid by the previous buyer. It takes a while for the city to catch up, because to assess your taxes on your new property base tax, so you're going to get a supplemental tax bill. So it's really important that you pay attention, make sure that they know that they will get a tax bill. Brokers, this talks about compensation, but I want to stress that the brokers are not a party to this contract. This contract is between the buyer and the seller. Regarding compensation, there's a separate agreement in regards to compensation, and that's through the listing agent. The listing agent has his deal with the seller as far as compensation, and through the MLS, that cooperating broker compensation is offered through the MLS. Whether that's 2.5 or 3 or maybe even 2, so that's handled separately. Representative capacity. Now, a lot of times properties are either sold or bought as an entity, an LLC, a corporation, or there's a trust. An entity can't sign an agreement. That has to be signed by an individual as a representative of that entity. So if that is the case, that has to be notated, and there's a place to do so, and a separate form has to be filled out. This is basically saying that escrow is going to take all of these and put together escrow instructions. Um, and here we have on section number 21 that it deals with liquidated damages and how to um, rectify a dispute. So liquidated damages. Now I said that I would say to you why we want 3%, and that's because if this is an owner-occupied property, that when both buyer and seller initial liquidated damages, that the damages is limited to the 3% that is deposited. So that's why we want 3%. So that's, and we don't counsel our clients as to whether they want to do this or not. It has to be their own decision. They should seek the counsel of their own attorney. But that's what liquidated damages is. And if there is a dispute, everybody's agreeing off the bat to mediation. So that is this section right here. And then there is another option for arbitration, is that the parties agree, instead of a court battle to settle this score if mediation doesn't go anywhere, they will agree to arbitrate. And what that means is they sit down with a neutral third party, most likely a retired judge or real estate attorney, and they basically, it's the dispute is heard, and that person comes out with a decision, and that decision is final. You can't appeal it, and that's that. So if both parties agree to arbitration, then arbitration is in effect. Now, why would you agree to that? Well, for one thing, we can't counsel, once again, our clients. They need to seek the advice of an attorney. But a trial by court takes a long time. So it can go on for a very long time. Arbitration most likely is faster, and it possibly can save them money. So that's one of the reasons why they might go arbitration. But once again, it's their decision. We cannot tell them what to do. Selection of services. Basically, the selection of services is that we, as the agent or the broker, are going to recommend a service like an escrow company or an inspector, but we do not. If you select them, it's of your own choosing, and we do not guarantee the performance of those people. Then it goes into some definitions. Here's an important clause that is in every contract. Time is of the essence, meaning it has to be a give and take. There is a time frame on this agreement. Everybody has to be performing according to the time frame that is in this agreement. Expiration of offer. It defaults to 3 days. You can change that. You can make it shorter or whatnot, or if you have knowledge that the seller is out of the country, is not available for a week, you can make it longer. So that's that. So, and this is where you would check, is if it's representative capacity. So number 32 is the seller loves this offer, and we're going to accept it. So this is where they would accept it and sign it and accept it as is. But if there's a counter offer, they would check right here. So that's basically it. And if this was accepted, then either you as the buyer's agent or the buyer can initial confirming that acceptance. It's not required that that happens, but it's suggested that it does. Okay, so this section is where for you to put all of your information and the seller's agent information, that should all be filled out because it's really important information. I do want to point out that this was added about a year or so ago in regards to presentation of offer. Pursuant to the standard of practice of 1.7 of the Code of Ethics, if the buyer's broker makes a written request, the seller's broker shall confirm in writing that this offer has been presented. So that's in the Code of Ethics. And what does that mean? So if me as the buyer's agent emails the seller's agent saying, was my offer presented? The only responsibility that the seller's agent has is to respond in writing whether it was or not. So that is all that's required. A lot of agents are saying, well, you have to send back page 10 and the seller has to initial and reject the offer. That's not required. Neither is presenting of the offer. That is not required. The only thing that's required is that you email back saying, yes, your offer was presented. And you've satisfied that part. So also attaches the buyer inspection advisory. It really goes over that to be on the lookout for square footage and all this other stuff. And then the California Consumer Privacy Act. This has to do with what we do with collecting consumers' information. We belong to an MLS, and that MLS has information in it and what happens to it. We as a brokerage, I don't think falls at this point under this Privacy Act because there's certain limitations as far as how much revenue you make and all of that. So that is the RPA, and I'm going to check. First, I'm going to check the chat room, and I don't see any messages there. I'm going to check Facebook, see if there's any questions. Okay. So George has a question. Can the seller cancel after appraisal and inspection contingencies? George, the seller can't cancel unless the buyer isn't performing. So if the buyer's performing and doing everything that they're supposed to do, then the seller can't cancel. Remember I said, if you're a listing agent and you're talking to your seller, when you're sitting down about ready to accept an offer or counter an offer, make sure you let your seller know that offer is you're stuck with that buyer. You, Mr. Seller, are stuck with this buyer unless they don't perform. Now, if they've done the appraisal and they haven't removed the appraisal contingency, and you give them a notice to perform, and 2 days after you give that notice to perform, they haven't performed, then your seller can cancel. So that is the only question I see, and I'm going to quickly go on to. I want to talk about quickly because what time is it? It's a little after five.
5:06.
5:06. I'm going to go on. I'm going to talk about the representative capacity. Remember, I said that a buyer can't, an entity can't sign a contract. A person as a representative for the entity can. So this form is confusing, I know. So how it's going to be filled out is, say that there is a trust and Mr. Buyer is a trustee. So this form is going to say Mr. Buyer, comma, trustee. Ooh, that's not a comma. Mr. Buyer, trustee. So this is a disclosure that Mr. Buyer, trustee for the Mr. Buyer Trust, he is the trustee for the Mr. Buyer Trust, and it's going to be signed by Mr. Buyer, and his title is the trustee. So that's how you fill out this form. Now, I'm going to warn you, by changing these areas, it kind of screws up your cover page, that on subsequent forms, things are going to be a little screwed up, but you can always go back and change it on the form, and it's only this form that it screws it up. It's only this form that you're going to need it in this order, so that when you change it on other forms, they're going to be right. So then everything is going to be in the name of Mr. Buyer Trustee. So that's going to be who the buyer is. It's not going to be Mr. Buyer Trust. It's not going to be Mr. Buyer. It's going to be Mr. Buyer, comma, trustee. And he needs to sign as that everywhere. So just know that. That's one thing I wanted to go over. I do want to look at really quick another confusing form. Remember, I talked to contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, when the buyer has to sell his house in order to buy the new one. The very first line of this form is the most important. The agreement is contingent on the close of escrow of the buyer's property. So it's on the close of escrow. That's the length of this contingency. Until that property closes, this contingency stays into effect. Now, there are some time frames here that if the buyer's property is not in escrow yet, then the buyer has 17 days or how many other days to get into escrow. And when a listing agent says, if the buyer has gotten into escrow after this has all been agreed upon, the seller's agent says, well, you have to remove the contingency for the sale of the buyer. You do not remove that contingency. What you remove is, and you make it very clear, that you are removing the buyer's getting into escrow on a property. You're not removing the contingency. The contingency stays into effect for the entire period until that property closes. And another thing I want you to do when you're doing this, I'm pointing out the time frames. Default on the time frames on this agreement for inspections, contingencies, and everything else are are as specified in the agreement is the default. But if you check this box, it's on the day after the buyer delivers to the seller that the evidence that they went into escrow. So you can delay that until they get into escrow. And in regards to the deposit, the default is per the agreement, or you can check this box that 3 days after they get into escrow. But I'm telling you right now, no listing agent worth any salt is going to let you get away with that. They're going to want you to have some skin in the game. They're going to want to have that deposit. So just so that. But here in number 8 regarding backup offers, if 8B is not checked, which I want you to check it, at any time once you get into escrow, even if your buyer hasn't gotten into escrow on his property, the seller can say, I want you to remove this contingency or we're going to cancel. So that's, you don't want that to happen. What this does is this delays it, that the seller can't invoke that provision for 17 days or whatever amount of days. So you have some breathing room to get you into escrow. So you want to check that box. Now there is this box during the entire term of the agreement. Once again, I don't think a listing agent is going to allow you to do that. One more form that I want to quickly go over because it's relevant right now is the CVA, the coronavirus addendum. Okay. So here's the coronavirus addendum. And basically you as the buyer's agent will attach this as an addendum to the purchase agreement. It is not a mandatory thing. If the seller doesn't agree, then it doesn't come into effect. So basically what it is, it's addressing the coronavirus, the state that we are in. And there's an extension of time for the buyer to remove some contingencies. And in the beginning of all this, there was problems getting in appraisals, getting inspectors. So you would want this leeway in order to that you can extend it for up to 30 days, if you were affected and you couldn't get this stuff done. And going hand in hand with that you can extend the time of escrow, because if you're delaying one thing, it delays everything. So you would have to delay escrow also in order to get the transaction done. Now there's still, we're still in this pandemic. We're still affected by coronavirus. I mean, Governor Newsom just today said, where we were allowed to go into a restaurant and have a meal, as long as we practice social distancing and wore the mask and all that suddenly has gone away. So at any time we can be backtracked. So it's still a good idea to try to get this agreed upon. So, and then the fifth one is immediate mutual cancellation. That's where, hey, I'm affected by Corona. I'm giving you the NUCC to show you that I'm affected by the Corona, and I'm walking away. So once again, not mandatory, it's a voluntary thing, but both sides have to agree to it. So I'm going to check Facebook. Feel free to ask questions. I don't see any questions there. I don't see any questions in the chat. I've stopped sharing my thing. So it's 5:15. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope I was a little bit informative. You can always ask me questions. I'm available, and thanks, Kim, for monitoring. And I'll see you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and good selling. All right.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Kim.
Okay, bye-bye.